Welcome here. Please remain standing for our opening hymn, which will be number 120. You'll find that printed in your bulletins. And let us begin. Please be seated. My name is Thomas Reimer, and I am the pastor here at Rockway, and I'll speak on behalf of this congregation to welcome you all here this morning, family and friends of Ed Harder, as we celebrate and give thanks for the life of such a wonderful and loving person. And as we share these words and images and music in honor of his passing. It's pretty warm in here, and it may not get much cooler as the service progresses, so please be caring toward yourselves. And if you do feel like you need a breath or some water, at any point, please don't feel shy about making your way out into the foyer. The new part of the building does have air conditioning, which this old sanctuary doesn't. The sacredness of this moment, sitting here outside our usual routines to look directly at life and death. This isn't the kind of sacredness that's going to get disturbed by some shuffling around. This will take all the noise and the heat, the joy and the grief that we can pour into it. It's a time where we are fully human, even as we approach mysteries that are beyond us. I ask that you pause with me now as I ask for God's blessing on those of us gathered here, on this space, and on this moment. Loving God, source of goodness, giver and taker of life, we offer this service to you and all that we bring here, our happy memories and our difficult ones, our feelings of levity, of wonder and admiration, our grief and our loss. We extend all these as offerings to you and ask that you reach out to us and receive them, and bless us with your touch in the exchange, with your presence, that we might be lifted in our spirits and comforted in our pain. These are the lives we offer you in living and return to you when our time comes around. Amen. I invite those of you who are sharing this morning to just follow along in your programs and come up to the front when it's your turn, and maybe don't come up when it's not your turn. And we will start with Beck and with Rach.
Hi everyone, I'm Rebecca, and this is Rachel. Mom had pretty strict time limits on all the speakers, but we figure we get a couple extra minutes as his daughters. In a photo book that we made for Mom and Dad, documenting 35 years on the farm, there is an entire page dedicated to Dad with photos of him wearing various hats, ranging from toques to ball caps, from hard hats to bike helmets. We joked that he was the man of many hats. And as we thought about how best to honor him, we naturally started to put our memories into categories or under different hats, you might say. Because it is true that Dad did indeed wear many hats throughout his life, and yet there were common threads that wove them all together.
Dad as tree planter and gardener and lover of nature and land. It is safe to say that Dad planted thousands of trees in his lifetime, most of them on the farm in West Garifraxa. He planted windrows to act as snow fence, he planted hardwoods to beautify the property, and he had the forethought to plant a Christmas tree farm so that the grandkids could one day cut down their own Christmas trees, which we did for years. I'll never forget a Sunday phone call I had with him back in my university days when he said that he hadn't gone to church that day, but rather took a walk amongst the trees, and that was as spiritual an experience as any for him. When he visited us at our cottage, his favorite thing to do was walk slowly along the trail through the old cedar forest. He always stopped to admire those magnificent trees and wonder at the awe and beauty that surrounded him. Besides trees, Dad also had a love of gardening. In the early years on the farm, he and Mom planted and tended massive veggie gardens. Over the years, the veggie gardens got smaller, and he found incredible joy in designing and tending to the flower beds. He had a particular fondness for the formal rose beds, and I think it was because they always reminded him of his mother, who also loved roses. It was in these beautiful gardens that both of us were married. Leading up to the weddings, he prepared the yard, pond, and gardens with love and care so that they were just perfect. After they moved to Elora, Dad continued to find joy in gardening and landscaping, though it be on a much smaller scale. Over the last couple of seasons, this activity became harder for him to do, but he enjoyed instructing his kids and grandkids on how to do it for him. It had to be just right. And just a week before he went into the hospital, he asked Mom if he could go with her to select the tomato plants for their garden this year. He was not able to get out of the car, but he still approved her selections from the rolled down window of the passenger seat.
Dad as a builder. After a few test trials in different careers, Dad eventually found an occupation he was passionate about, building. He learned and picked up many skills as he was building our first family home on the farm. A crazy project that involved moving an old log house from one location and putting it back together like a puzzle on their newly purchased land. From there, he went on to create a successful construction business, doing countless renos and additions in the Fergus Elora and Guelph and KW areas. His reputation became one of high quality and a keen eye for design. He hardly ever had to advertise, and there were times when he would finish a job, he just got new work up and down the same street because all the neighbors wanted to hire him. He worked for a number of artists over the years, and as an art lover and collector, he was more than happy when he could trade his construction work for a painting or a sculpture. As a result, their home is filled with a beautiful art collection. Although all the trades loved him, he certainly did stand out as a different kind of builder. We knew, even as kids, that he was considered a bit odd in the industry, and his job sites were the only ones in town where you would hear the CBC and classical music playing. One very touching moment from the Elora visitation last weekend in our parents' backyard was when the family from the local lumber yard came to pay their respects. Dixon's was a place that Dad went to probably thousands of times during his years as a contractor. The Dixon family remembered Ed fondly as the perfect customer with a smile, who never complained, never got mad, but somehow he always left the store with exactly what he wanted. Over the decades, Dad shared his skills not only by helping us with our home projects, but he also gave back to other organizations. Silver Lake Mennonite Camp was a special place for him, and through the 1990s, Dad served on the board of directors, playing a pivotal role in shaping the future of our camp. Dad's vision and meticulous planning were also crucial in the development and rebuilding of many new cabins. He attended many camp work weekends and volunteered countless hours during those years. One volunteer experience that had a huge impact on him was spending a month in Alabama with the Mennonite Disaster Service, where he helped rebuild homes after Hurricane Katrina.
Dad, the world traveler and explorer. Dad was always curious about the world and a natural adventurer. He and Mom went on their first big adventure together in 1969 when they quit their jobs and sailed to Europe, where they spent the next 10 months. During that time, their eyes were opened and their worldview changed. Recently, Dad delighted in telling the teenage grandkids about the 5 nights they spent sleeping out in the open on the Isle of Wight, where a multi-day music festival, the European version of Woodstock, was being held. They saw Leonard Cohen, Joni Mitchell, The Who, among other major folk and rock musicians of the time. What cool grandparents. Later in life, when work was slowing down, they began traveling a lot again. As I recall, it was always Dad who started researching the next destination and declared it time to go on a trip. Mom was always more than happy to go along. They traveled through Mexico regularly, but also to Central and South America, back to Europe many times, as well as to Morocco, the UAE, and Oman, and more recently, an unforgettable cruise in the high Arctic. Beck and I were both inspired by their travel, and when we chose to live abroad, Dad was encouraging and supportive, and of course, it was an excuse for them to travel. They visited me as a student in Northern Ireland, and later came to see our family when we lived in New Zealand. They also visited Beck and her family in Germany, where they were living there for a year. Though Dad enjoyed a slower pace when traveling, cafes and people watching being a favorite pastime, he was not a lazy man. Mom and Dad always loved hiking, and one of their major adventures after retirement was walking the 800-kilometer ancient pilgrimage of the Camino de Santiago through France and Spain. What an inspiration that was for me. I believe Dad was in his 40s when he discovered a love of cycling. He started off with local trips, but then had his sights set on more ambitious rides. He and his longtime employee, Paul, cycled for 2 weeks in Ireland, and then he and Ranj cycled across the country from Vancouver to PEI, starting when Dad was 51. He continued to do more trips in his 60s and 70s, the last one being in 2016, when he spent 3 weeks cycling along the Danube River from its source in Germany all the way to Budapest. I was honored and, to be honest, nervous to join him for the last 2 weeks of that trip. I had never really cycled than a couple of kilometers at a time. He reassured me that it would be easy and that it would be downhill all the way. That wasn't completely true. It was, however, a wonderful trip with my dad, and one I will always treasure. Wherever he traveled, Dad was never afraid to get lost or go off trail. It was always part of the journey. Beck and I remember some uncomfortable moments in rural Mexico and Venezuela when we rented a car and clearly got lost. Dad never stressed and said everything was fine and seemed to love the challenge and adventure. In general, he was quick to get off the main highway and find the back roads on any road trip, even if it meant possibly getting lost. The slower pace and the better scenery, and maybe a little adventure along the way, always made it worthwhile. Mom says Dad was the best travel partner. They both loved hiking, art, architecture, history, and music, and they could be relaxed and spontaneous. Right up until the end of his life, Dad longed to travel. His best memories were of him and Mom together on a trip. Even if at the end it was just down to the village of Elora to share a beer and a burger on a patio, this to him was bliss.
Dad as Grandpa Extraordinaire. The boys will share their own memories of their grandpa, but we would like to highlight that he was indeed an extraordinary grandpa and male role model in their lives. Dad was not adverse to risk, and since it was clear that he believed the parents were often too overprotective, he countered that by giving them all the freedom that they would want, often encouraging risky behavior. The 100-acre farm, a big barn, and a shop full of power tools was a dream for 5 boys under the age of 10. He also believed in exposing them to art, history, and culture. One weekend, when they were all still quite young, he and Granny took them all on the train to Toronto for an overnight with the express intent to spend time at the Art Gallery of Ontario. Later, after the move to Elora, he regularly took them into the village for ice cream or out for dinner. When asked once upon their return what they did with Granny and Grandpa, they responded, "We went out to the pubs." From then on, they called going out for dinner going to the pubs. Dad never treated them like small children. He believed in toughening them up or preparing them for the world and having real conversations. They really adored him, and there was nothing more powerful than watching them all gather around his hospital bed at the end of his life. The room was filled with love and joy. And just a note of thanks to Nicholas. As the oldest grandchild, Nick and Grandpa had a pretty special connection. And over the last year or so, as mobility got tougher for Dad, Nick took on a real caregiving role with him. He accompanied them to Costa Rica last winter, and in the last 6 months, he went weekly to their house to do overnights and help however he could. And in the final days of his life, Nick hardly left Dad's side and looked after Granny and the mums with so much care. Thanks, Nick. And then Dad as our dad. Our dad, as a father, was kind, affectionate, generous, and thoughtful. I don't ever recall a time that he yelled or even raised his voice, but that being said, he was not a pushover and somehow always seemed to get what he wanted from us, and he pushed us past our comfort zones.
The way he treated everyone he worked with or met with respect and kindness continues to be an inspiration and a lesson to us both. When we married, he welcomed Dwayne and Matt into the family without hesitation, and they became his 2 sons. Over the years, Matt and Dad had many in-depth conversations, and it's safe to say no one made him laugh more than Dwayne. He had a quiet generosity about him. He was notorious for heading into town on Christmas Eve to finish his shopping, even though it was clear he'd been thinking about what he planned to get for a long time. He loved music and often gifted us with CDs of musicians he loved or recently discovered artists, and more often than not, supporting local musicians. Not too many years ago, he showed up at a Valentine's brunch with roses for Mom and Beck and I. Even Mom didn't know how he had pulled it off, and they had driven together. When it became too hard for him to get out on his own, he recruited friends or his grandsons to help him pick up gifts for his girls. He taught us to be generous in giving to charities, and he always offered to support us financially if we were ever in need. Dad was slow but deliberate in everything he did. He was affectionately named Steady Eddie by the guys he played hockey with every week for years. Though his slowness could on occasion drive his family nuts, we now value the pace at which he went through life, literally stopping to smell the roses. He and Mom modeled a marriage of respect, deep companionship, adventure, and love. Mom just said this week that he really was the best life partner, and that their 56 years of marriage was the real deal. He never said it explicitly, but we always knew he was proud of us. He lived a full and value-centered life, and he was a solid pillar on which we all rested. Thank you.
Good morning. His friends knew my dear brother as Ed, but he was always Edgar to me, and he was fine with that. Edgar died on my 83rd birthday. Andy and I got the news the next morning while we were on a tour of the Balkan countries. We were staying in a small village in Croatia on a family farm. It was so peaceful, and people were so kind. A place Edgar would have loved. And now I want to share a few memories. When I started school at age 6, and Edgar was 3.5, I would come home from school, sit him down in a chair in front of a makeshift table with pencils, crayons, and paper, and attempt to teach him everything I had learned that day. He was such a good student. Just sat there and smiled. But as we got older, his easygoing personality would sometimes drive me crazy. So I would pinch him when I got really frustrated. Pinch, pinch. Years later, he showed me the scars. I said, I am so sorry. Of course, he quickly forgave me, and that was that. My family loved coming to the farm for visits and weddings. My girls adored their uncle. And over the years, my husband Fred and I enjoyed a very close friendship with Edgar and Joanne. I'm so grateful for the visits I've had with Edgar in recent years, sharing stories of our childhood, some very funny and others very difficult, and all with a glass of wine in hand. Edgar had an amazing memory. I could always count on him to recall events and dates that I had forgotten. When our mother passed away after 20 years ago, after a lengthy battle with Huntington's, we all went out for dinner to the Oban Inn in Niagara. The waiter approached our table, and Edgar said with his infectious smile, "We're here to celebrate because our mother just died." The waiter had a stunned look on his face. And today we are celebrating. And I believe that Edgar is smiling down on us. But we will continue to grieve, miss him terribly, and remember.
We are the rural delivery. And we emerged out of our farming experiences in the earliest 70s, West Garifraxa Township. And yes, Ed was a member of that band. And after a 30-year hiatus, we got back together just a little over a year ago, essentially singing songs around the table at Ed and Joanne's, and now it's come to an abrupt end. So we're going to do a song. Our ranks are thinning. So today we have invited my son Matthew and Bob's son Ben to join us.
So the song was one of Ed's favorites on road trips, and of course he did road trips on 2 wheels and on 4. And this one we sang quite often, and I think it was likely because it had hammer in the title, but I think there were some other reasons which really I can't explain. I had a hammer. Take this hammer, take it to the captain. Take this hammer, take it to the captain. Take this hammer, take it to the captain. Tell him I'm gone, boy. Tell him I'm gone. If he asks you, was I running? If he asks you, was I running? If he asks you, was I running? Tell him I was flying. Tell him I was flying. Take this hammer, take it to the captain. Take this hammer, take it to the captain. Take this hammer, take it to the captain. Just tell him I'm gone. Tell him I'm gone. that road to freedom, walking down that road to freedom, walking down that road to freedom. Just tell 'em I'm gone, boy. Tell 'em I'm gone. Take this hammer, take it to the captain. Take this hammer, take it to the captain. Take this hammer, take it to the captain. Tell him I'm gone. Tell him I'm gone.
I'm very honored to read this beautiful Mary Oliver poem that Joanne chose for Ed. When I am among the trees. When I am among the trees, especially the willows and the honey locust, equally the beech, the oaks, the pines, they give off such hints of gladness. I would almost say they save me daily. I am so distant from the hope of myself, in which I have goodness and discernment, and never hurry through the world, but walk slowly and bow often. Around me, the trees stir in their leaves and call out, "Stay a while." The light flows from their branches. And they call again. "It's simple," they say. And you too have come into the world to do this, to go easy, to be filled with light, and to shine.
I grew up in this Mennonite congregation, so I've known Ed for as long as I can remember, as much as I knew many of you back when I was a kid, by your faces and your smiles. With Ed, I also knew him through some small jobs he had done for my parents, a railing going up the front steps of our house, and more significantly for me, the cover on the cistern out back, which he had built out of 2x4s. That cistern always had a kind of magic for me, and I opened that cover a lot to check the water level or put the pump back in. It came from Ed's hands into mine. I think it was Ed who made that. My first real conversation with the man himself happened during a big transition for me, when I wanted to leave my studies and go into carpentry. I drove out to Elora just as Ed and Joanne were renovating their house, the day they were pouring the new foundation. Their yard was full of tradespeople, and a couple of them made comments as I entered about their fondness and respect for Ed. Maybe Paul will say something about that in a bit. I was disappointed that Ed wasn't taking any apprentices on at that point, but he certainly helped me understand the landscape of what I was getting into and pointed me in a good direction. Ed seemed to radiate warmth and patience and generosity. He was very much like the trees in Mary Oliver's poem, giving off these hints that life is simple and good, and that we should stay a while. I wish it had been in his cup to stay with us a bit longer. My last visit with Ed was in the hospital, surrounded by his family, and it was clear that these qualities of character weren't his alone. The way his family sat with him, speaking to him with comfort and reassurance day after day, waiting with him as long as it took for him to find his way across that threshold. Joanne called it their vigil, which is such a beautiful and substantial word, and that's exactly what it was. Waiting with him and keeping watch, making sure he wasn't alone in those final tremendous hours. It was among the trees, not willows or pines, but a grove of olive trees at the foot of a mountain, that Jesus sat down with the knowledge of his own imminent death and prayed that God might spare him. And he asked his closest friends, his cousins James and John and his friend Peter, to stay awake and pray with him, to keep watch and remain in vigil. We know that they weren't quite up for it and dozed off as soon as Jesus turned inward, like they needed his attentions to stay awake. We can't really fault them for this, or only as much as we would fault ourselves in their place. I don't think they were eating all that well, and I think Jesus kept them moving around a lot. So in this nice, quiet grove, sleep must have felt irresistible. And they were also going through a lot emotionally, accompanying their companion in what he kept saying were his final days. Luke says that Jesus found them sleeping not because of laziness, but, quote, because of grief. I hope Jesus still found comfort in their presence, even if he worried about their souls. Grief can be exhausting. And it was a long vigil for Joanne, for Rebecca and Rachel, the grandkids, and all of you who were close with Ed in his last days. They have earned their sleep. But on a more spiritual level, we pray that even in the midst of their grief, their loss of such a good man as Ed, that God, you will turn your divine attentions towards them and keep them awake to your will for them, to the needs of others, and to the goodness still in this world. And we pray that Ed has found his own garden, a garden of sublime rest and infinite consciousness, of unbounded energy and a quiet, easygoing peace in your presence. Amen.
Our friend Ed. You know, it came to me that Ed had lived and traveled to a lot of places in his life, and he had moved in a lot of different circles. And I would say that in every one of those circles, he had friends. I'm not sure exactly why it is. He just had such an easygoing manner, and it seemed effortless to him. But I think the phrase was already used. He was the real deal. And I think that's as much as explains it enough. So I guess I'm one of his earlier friends, although growing up, Ed was really a friend of my older brother, Gary's. And they were both really interested in all manners of science and math. And that's why that photograph on the back of the Mary Oliver poem really resonates for me. Someone in their wisdom said, really chop it down, Al. And so this was an 8 by 11. So I'm going to chop ahead to Ottawa days. And this was after Ed and Joanne were married, of course, and also after they had been in Europe for a good year, or about a year. And they ended up back in Ottawa, and there were a group of us there. And it was a time that we really learned a lot. And we were trying to figure out what the important things in life were, and got involved in the peace movement. We became pretty socially and politically active, and it was a time of bonding for sure. And Ed and I and two other friends, it was a time when you could get grants. We're talking about the early 70s, and I'm not sure which grant we got, but we did get a grant to do a summer camp for, I guess they were up to grade 1, I wasn't sure, but it was mainly preschoolers, and they were from, underprivileged families and needed a lot of supervision. Well, they didn't get it from us. In fact, Ed's main role was taking care of transportation, and Ed and Joanne had a VW minibus. And when we did a lot of side trips, day trips, and we just loaded them up. Of course, no child seats, no seat belts. I don't think there were even seats. But somehow, and these were kids that were not used to a lot of restraints, so that we didn't give them very many. But fortunately, we got through the whole camp without any disasters. So that's a memory that will stick with me a long time. Again, jumping forward, Ed became a teacher, and he had a few stops along the way before they ended up in West Garifraxa, where another group of us were. And there's so many things to relate about that, but what really got us closer to Ed and Joanne was that we were both farming with sheep. And of course, at this point, our kids were too young, but Beck and Rachel were a part of that. And but at that point, making money seemed to be kind of secondary until we ran out of it. And I think Ed and Joanne saw the light first, and Ed said, maybe contracting and building is going to be something that might have a future. So that was really how we got a start. We got him into sheep farming, and he realized he had to get out. Now, Ranj is going to come up and talk about road trips, both the two-wheel and the four-wheel type, but I just wanted to say that there was many of them, and a tradition developed pretty early on with Ed. Every time we went on a road trip, he would buy a new shirt. Now, I don't know how many there are in that closet, but he was dedicated on buying a new shirt each time. So, road trips, well, of course, when Ed lost his mobility, we thought, well, what could we do? And we did some mini ones, and especially during the winter. And they were very memorable. Range at the helm. Ed would be the navigator and add the play-by-play. And I would be in the back seat trying to add a bit of color. And for some reason, we went to Bell Fountain for one of them. I'm not exactly sure why. But the other two were planned. And the one had to do with visiting various farms and shrines in West Garifraxa, which Ed loved. And he even convinced us that we should drive up the laneway right to the old log house. I don't think that was mentioned, that it wasn't log house, it was a log house. And I was so pleased to see that it was still standing, because back in the day, I don't think Ed knew much more than I did about foundations, but we were the ones that laid the blocks to that foundation. But he had a great chat with the new owners, and then the next one that was very meaningful, and that was with Paul. We did a tour of all the houses in Ferguson, Elora that Ed had built, and the stories came out, so that was wonderful. So I think I'm going to take my leave now and just say, I miss you. All these memories are going to stick with me. You've been a wonderful friend. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Ranj. I've known Ed for about 40 years, which I know is a very short time to many of you here. During that time, I've had the good fortune to travel with Ed on many, many occasions. Ed loved to travel, and we managed to complete a few bicycle trips, most of them on long weekends in the United States. And with Al Coop, Ed came along with us on our Civil War trips. And he was always very patient in indulging us. While we explored the battlefields of the Civil War, Ed checked out the local newspapers and cafes. That's what he was good at. But by far the longest trip that Ed and I did together was our 8-week bike camping trip across Canada. That trip taught me everything I needed to know about Ed. Uncomplaining, steadfast, a great listener. Ed wasn't much for small talk, and our lengthy silences were often broken by a midstream monologue of some childhood memory or a sudden diatribe on world politics. We solved a lot of problems on that trip. That was the way it was. You could tell this guy anything, and he always had something to add or a question to ask. Hours spent riding together was just the right venue to slowly, comfortably, well, except for the saddle sores, share our thoughts and our views. Ed was always there when I needed to lean on him, a not infrequent occurrence. I learned what a deeply kind, thoughtful, intelligent man he was. He told me how his mother had taught him the importance of being nice to people. And I knew that if there was anything I ever wanted to know about apples, this farm boy was the man to ask. One of the things that struck me about Ed was the many different lives he lived. Some of that's been mentioned already. Farm worker, golf course maintenance, personnel representative. I still try to get this picture in my head of Ed in a 3-piece suit zooming around Northern Ontario in a Corvette, but I can't quite get there yet. And a contractor were some of the jobs he did. He also had wide interests, including gardening, cycling, hockey, music, and lots of volunteering. After Ed was diagnosed with Huntington's, I asked him if he was busy completing a bucket list of things he still wanted to do in life. He thought about that for a while, and he said he was already happy living his life just the way he was, spending his days with family, friends, and travel. I thought, what a testament to a life well lived when you are perfectly content to carry on living just as you have been. Right up to the end, Ed continued to demonstrate what rock-solid integrity, quiet dignity, and selflessness look like. His mother taught him to be nice. And one more story about the bike trip. We were cycling across the prairies when I was seized by a sudden bout of stomach upset. Let's call it that. All around us, as far as the eye could see, there was flat, open land with no trees anywhere, except for a small copse of trees that was impossibly far away. Without saying a word to Ed, I raced to the trees, threw down my bike, and disappeared into the woods. And when I walked back to the road, Ed was waiting for me, straddling his bike, and in his hand, he held out a tablet of Imodium. Now there's a guy you can rely on.
First, my sincere thanks to you, Joanne, Rebecca, and Rachel for granting me the opportunity to reflect on a good friend's work life. I was fortunate enough to be his employee from the mid-1980s for almost 20 years. We worked together that long. It didn't seem like that long. Didn't seem like a long time at all. And it sure didn't feel like work. With Ed, there was never an urgency that we associate with work life. We'd go to Dixon's, pick up lumber, go to Tim's, get a coffee, always cream, never milk. We'd drive to some pleasant couple's house and spend social time together. Do some nailing, do some cutting, shingling, drywalling. That's what happened. With Ed, it was always an adventure. A joyful adventure. Ed loved the word organic. The project, the plan was organic. It grew like a morning glory. It developed like a symphony. There was always a set of plans rolled up behind the seat of his truck. But Ed, what are we actually going to do today? Well, in the 1980s and 90s, you could do this. Ed would unfold an empty pack of Du Mauriers and pull out a pencil and drop the changes that he'd made on the basis of the conversation he had with a customer the night before. And the building inspectors in those days just had faith in Ed's judgment. They would nod, okay, and sign off. It wouldn't happen today. In those early years, often Joanne, with maybe Shirley or Ella, would arrive on the job around noon with Joanne with her wicker basket, covered with a white picnic, covered with a serviette containing so many wonderful homemade treats, finger food, made with avocado and shrimp, tempura, quesadillas, seasoned with cumin, rosemary, paprika. And for dessert, plots, cupcakes with colored icing and drizzled with lemon zest. I remember that. And peaches. In season, there was always peaches. We were a burger and fries kind of guys. And this was a stunning new departure in culinary for us. Joanne, we love to do renos at your house. The subtrades The subtaids came on the job, they were pretty hardcore Q107 guys. But Ed would have his little box radio with the coat hanger aerial, and it would have Peter Zosky interviewing the conductor of the Toronto Symphony on in the morning, or it would have Clyde Gilmore in the afternoon with Gilmore's albums. It used to drive the AC/DC crowd crazy. But they got used to it, and actually they came to kind of like it. His job sites were always so comfortable. They were an inviting place to be. It just made you smile. Take a deep breath and relax. So this was Ed. The guy who would hire folks other employers would pass by, guy who would suggest to Jim Dixon at the hardware store that he might, the food bank might need the Christmas turkeys more than the contractors. Guy who would take his, after working a hard week, he would go to Silver Lake and work there on the weekends. A man who raised 2 wonderful daughters and was blessed with 5 grandsons. He was spontaneous. One morning in the late 80s, a young employee, Paul Ziegler, said, "Hey, Ed, we should go to a ball game, like today." So we packed our tools, hopped in the truck, scalped some tickets, and sat 8 rows back of the Jays dugout, watched Tony Fernandez, Kelly Gruber, George Bell on a Thursday afternoon. And only when I wrote this did I wonder what Joanne said when he got home. Ed and I spent, as you heard, Ed and I spent a couple of weeks cycling on the west coast of Ireland, from Shannon over to Galway, down to Cork and into Dublin. He and Joanne hosted wonderful Christmas parties for the crew. So I know I was supposed to talk about work, and you might be wondering if we got anything done there. But when you have a happy bunch of folks enjoying what they're doing, there are good results. You can ask any employee, any subcontractor, and what you'll hear are stories about Ed the person, the way he respected folks, his gentle leadership, the order and organization on his site. You mention his name and the conversation starts with a smile and fond memories. So we know that before Ed Harder Construction, he was a reluctant educator. Not that he wasn't a great teacher, he just didn't enjoy teaching that curriculum. But as a contractor, he taught in his quiet way so many things: ethics, respect for everyone, no matter who. You learn to work cooperatively. Trades learn to plan and accommodate one another. And I think a lot of young people who worked with Ed were exposed to a workplace that shaped their expectations for their work life ahead. During our working life together, and then for 20 years since, through Ed and Joanne, I've been introduced to so many wonderful people, and for that I'm grateful. So thanks, Ed, for being the example, the mentor that you were and that you are.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. Grandpa meant so much to his 5 grandsons, so each of us are going to share some of our favorite memories. I'm Nick. For those of you who don't know, in 2022, Grandpa's dear friend Ranj spent some time interviewing Grandpa and wrote a beautiful biography called Be Nice, the Ed Harder Story. I was asked to write a favorite memory to be included in the book, and I wrote about Christmas 2012. Here is what I wrote. Grandpa got each of his 5 grandsons toolboxes for Christmas. He spent plenty of time explaining each of the tools, showing us how to use them. Not only were the toolboxes personal in the way that they symbolized Grandpa's work and passion, but each of them was used at some point in his life. This memory has stuck with me for a long time. I think it really depicts who Grandpa is. He is selfless. He is caring. He is a man who wants to pass on the knowledge and skills that he's learned over the years. I've learned so much from Grandpa, and I continue to. In a few days, I'm heading to Elora to learn to trim a hedge, a skill that I know Grandpa has perfected and will be useful in my life. I'm so grateful for all that Grandpa has done for me and will do for me. Now, I did learn how to trim a hedge, but not with a healthy amount of constructive criticism from Grandpa. He continued teaching and passing on his knowledge for the rest of his days. In May, some of us went to help Granny and Grandpa in the garden. Even though his mobility was very minimal, he was adamant that he would help trim the roses. Although he couldn't do it himself, he taught Noah how to do it the right way, the Ed Harder way. This was the last time we saw him at his beautiful home that he built. I love you and miss you, Grandpa, and you can rest assured that your wisdom will never be forgotten.
I'm Adam. Grandpa always enjoyed doing things that he knew would make all of us grandkids happy. There have been many times that I can remember where Grandpa always had a great idea for something to do that he knew we would all enjoy. The classic idea was always to go get ice cream, which was always a treat because most of the time there was no limit on how many scoops we were allowed to get. There was one special time where Grandpa suggested we go to this one specific ice cream spot, which just so happened to be near the farm. This added an extra treat to the trip, as we got to drive past and remember all the fun we had had on the farm, with him and with everyone. Another special idea that Grandpa had was that we could use the crawl space in their house as a mini stick arena. At the time, we were much younger and smaller, so this crawl space seemed like the perfect place to play. Of course, Grandpa had to play with us. I can imagine he was quite uncomfortable in the small place, but it did not matter to him because I'm sure he had a lot of fun and he knew that we all had a lot of fun playing with him. There have been countless other times where Grandpa has done similar things, which shows how much he loved us and how much he enjoyed spending time with us.
I'm Noah. Out of the many things Grandpa was, he was a great farmer. He tended to his farmland with care and purpose. Over the years of being at the farm, he planted thousands of trees. It was tradition for our whole family to walk down to the pine forest and cut down a Christmas tree that he once planted every year. I admire the dedication he put into such an amazing place where us grandkids could run around and play all throughout our childhood. From catching crayfish in the pond to building fires, Grandpa taught us so much about nature, and I am sure that is one of the reasons why I have such a love for the outdoors. Recently, Granny has told me how Grandpa always upkept the pond purely for the kids. He wasn't a big swimmer, though all of us kids were. On the contrary, he was a big skater. All of us cousins learned how to skate and play hockey on the pond thanks to Grandpa. Those winter days skating on the pond were the best kind of days. His work on the farm really reflected his love for us all. He was such a selfless, loving, and diligent man. The kind of grandpa I hope to be one day.
Hi everybody, I'm Kieran. When I was younger, I was always so excited to visit Granny and Grandpa on their farm. It was always so great to get out of the city and escape to their large property. I appreciated how Grandpa would give us the freedom to explore on our own. Like him, he wanted us to be independent and develop skills and thoughts without supervision and direction. He would also take us on small adventures to see new things. It was very important to him that his grandkids have new and unique experiences. Grandpa would constantly make fun memories with us on the farm. My favorite memory is of Grandpa putting us all in a trailer and pulling us around the farm with his riding lawnmower. We couldn't stop laughing and screaming because of how bumpy it was. I had so many memories on the farm, and I knew I would make a new one every time I went back. I think I am very similar to my grandfather because of these experiences. He has passed on to me his quietness, thoughtfulness, calmness, his ability to make others laugh, his dark hair and eyes, and his amazing tan. I'll miss you, Grandpa, and I'm proud to be Kieran Edgar Heidi.
Hey everyone, I'm Toby. When I think about my grandpa, what comes to mind is how he was always my greatest fan and one of my biggest supporters. Throughout some of the countless volleyball games that I've played, Grandpa would always try to make it out for as many as possible. I have amazing memories of him being able to watch Adam, Noah, Kieran, and I all play on the same team. As it became more difficult for him to watch us in person, he became an even bigger fan while watching a live stream. I remember countless times when I'd go to visit Granny and Grandpa, the first thing he would say to me would be something about a tournament I just played. Whether it be a compliment about myself or just some random statement, it was clear to me that he had watched every game. Another moment with Grandpa that I know that I'll never forget happened just a couple weeks ago when I went to visit him for the first time in the hospital. He had been sleeping almost the whole day, and he wasn't speaking much. I went over to say hi to him and tell him that it was Toby, and while I was talking to him, we noticed that he had his hand held out like this, asking for a fist bump. So I gave him one. Then, when we were leaving, I was saying goodbye, and we noticed that his hand was held out again in a fist, like he was asking for another fist bump. I gave him another one, and it was at that moment that I knew that even if he couldn't speak to us, he knew who was there with him, and he knew what we were saying to him, and that was a really special moment for me. Grandpa was always a huge supporter of the five of us, and that meant so much to us coming from someone that we've looked up to our whole lives. We love you, Gramps, and we'll all miss you.
Well, we are coming to the end of our time here together. A warm thank you to everyone who helped to shape this service, and to the Rockway hospitality team who helped with setup and have laid out some food and refreshments for our reception. That will take place downstairs in what we call the fellowship hall following the service. And there will also be a small family interment in Elora after that. And thank you to all of you who have come together here this morning. May the face of God shine on you in your own travels from here and keep you awake to the goodness and wonders in your own lives. And may you find some good shade among the trees. Our closing hymn is number 114, Now Thank We All Our God. We'll sing the first German verse and then the first English verse. Please rise if you are able.